Well, I couldn't resist showing the clip of the scene of Charlton Heston raising his hand over his head to part the Red Sea. It's a little kitschy and over the top, but it certainly makes the point about the miraculous nature of their escape from slavery. In fact, I find it more compelling than such rational explanations that a stiff wind blew all night long to dry the marshy land, making it possible for the people to walk across while the heavy chariots got stuck in the underlying mud. And sure, that makes it seem like it's possible, but you know what? I'd prefer to root for the impossible. But how they got across isn't as important as the fundamental message that once you were slaves in Egypt and now you are free. And that's more than walking with wet shoes. It takes God for that to happen. So they were trapped. On one side, water prevented their escape, and on the other side, 600 rapidly approaching Egyptian army chariots. Imagine hearing the sound, seeing the dust rise for miles, and feeling the rumble of the ground beneath their feet as those chariots advanced. And just before our passage today, verse 10 says, they were totally afraid. They cried out in terror to God. They told Moses, weren't the cemeteries in Egypt large enough? I mean, did you have to take us out here to the wilderness to die? I mean, what have you done to us? Back in Egypt, we told you, leave us alone. We're better off as slaves than as corpses in the wilderness. But of what were they really afraid? Was it death or freedom? I mean, for those who have never experienced it before, what is that thing called freedom? In 1937, 2,300 formerly enslaved African Americans were interviewed as part of the Depression-era Federal Writers Project. 88-year-old Mary Crane said she was 14 years old when President Lincoln set us all free. She said, I'm telling you, when I say my folks and friends did not regard freedom as an unmixed blessing. Ezra Adams said, I don't remember when I first regarded myself as free. Many of us just didn't understand what it was all about. Daniel Waring said, the former slaves where I lived knew they had an abundance of freedom, but they could not eat, wear, or sleep in it. They soon learned that freedom is nothing unless you have something to live in and a place to call home. Most of us know that Harriet Tubman was known as the Moses of her people. And you may recall she carried a gun with her as she led slaves along the Underground Railroad, and not just to protect from slave patrols, but to keep those who were afraid from turning back. Sometimes she had to say, if you don't follow me, I'm going to kill you. Turn back and die, or go forward and live. Standing at water's edge, the escaping Hebrews cried out for what was familiar, even though it was bondage. And then the sea parted, and they crossed. And on the other side, the prophet Miriam took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her dancing, and Miriam sang, horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. It's the earliest recorded song in the Bible. But their first day of freedom wasn't even over yet before they began to reminisce. Remember the fish we used to eat for nothing? The cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, garlic, but now? Again, that was the same day as their miraculous crossing. But of course, as Daniel Waring testified from personal experience, you can't eat, wear, or sleep in freedom. Freedom is at the center of many of our lives right now, on the top of our minds. Some are demanding freedom from the tyranny of wearing masks. Some are demanding freedom from being shot by police. Some just want freedom to leave quarantine, to hug and gather with friends again, and, of course, to return to such normal routines as coming home on Homecoming Sunday. Now, I recognize not all these examples are equal, but it's also not right to judge some grieving as worse than others, for grief is grief, and so is fear. The Hebrews were now free from slavery, from Egypt. The question is, for what? In their fears, freedom meant hunger, even though the promise was a land full of milk and honey. But of course, they also didn't know it would take 40 years to get there, because it would take them 40 years to unlearn a lifetime of bondage. Ask someone released from prison. Freedom from addiction. Freedom from an abuser can be hard if it's all you've ever known. Oppression, cruelty, tyranny. How long does it take for a society finally free from a tyrant to recover? We'll see. And then not to do it again. Now, note, God's liberation, God's great liberation narrative is always freedom from oppression, not an accommodation to it. I mean, we don't need tips and tricks for surviving. God's great liberation narrative, the primal, most simple, elemental, non-negotiable story at the heart of biblical faith. That's how Walter Brueggemann describes Exodus. God's great liberation narrative is freedom from cruelty, not a series of lessons in how to live with it. But freedom from also means freedom for something. And that's harder than going back. It's sacrificial. It's for a purpose. What was God's liberative purpose in opening the sea for them? And what liberation is God seeking for our world today? Out in the wilderness, the former slaves now had to learn to turn away from the tyranny of Pharaoh and resist the temptation to create it among themselves. It's what they knew. And in place of Pharaoh's wealth and absolute power, God gave them, quote, some of the most radical socioeconomic laws in human history. As Marcus Borg describes it, no interest was to be charged on loans to each other. Every Sabbath year, every seventh year, all debts owed to each other were to be forgiven, and any slaves that had been collected were to be released. Every Jubilee year, every 50th year, all agricultural land was to be returned at no cost to the original family of ownership. When they settled the land, all families were given a plot. But over time, families that ran into difficulty sometimes lost their land because of debt. In the Jubilee year, the land was to be restored to its original owner. You know, debt is something that we need liberation from. Debt, student debt, medical debt, totally unnecessary debt is something we need God's great liberation from. But in other words, the formerly enslaved were freed from those ancient systems built on injustice and domination. And with their freedom, they were to create shalom. Shalom is a world of well-being, of peace and wholeness. Jesus would describe it as the kingdom of God, or as we describe it, a world that is open, inclusive, just, and compassionate. So, what does all this say to the church on Homecoming Sunday? So, you know, in the best sense, homecoming means going back, telling stories, reminiscing, laughing. And at Park Hill, the youth group cooking hot dogs and Lance in his Black Panther costume. It's a regrouping and a regathering in one place to then be sent out into the world in courage and peace, Now, of course, not everyone's home or childhood was peaceful and loving, so returning home isn't equally nostalgic for everyone. So, in its idealized sense, homecoming may be a reminder of better times, and it's not unusual in some churches that after years of decline, its forward mission is actually a retreat. I mean, trying to recreate what worked well decades ago instead of crossing the sea to Freedom Land. You know, remember when the youth group sold those cucumbers and leeks and onions? Well, as we worship from home today, it could feel like the momentum of our church's steady forward mission over the past several years has been put on a forced retreat. But in contrast, instead of looking back and hoping to become again what we once were, God is leading us to become something we've never been before and something more than we could imagine on our own. Going forward, our congregation will be more than those who can get in their car and drive to church, or who did so when they lived here. It's not about now one place, but about becoming one people. As of today, earlier in the service, we are the church home of people, no matter where their home is located. And that's a new concept, but it's one that liberates us from location to vocation, to a shared vocation as people in the world who seek a world that is open, inclusive, just, and compassionate, wherever we live. Now, still in Park Hill, but also everywhere that Park Hill now lives. And I'll admit to you, it's going to take a little time to get used to this new identity, but God will make a way. It may not take the power of Charlton Heston's raising his hand, but it will require more of us than a dry cleaning bill for our shoes if we are to fully include more than just those we can wave to in the next pew. We certainly didn't know it then, but you know, the intentionality we gave to building relationships last fall has actually prepared us for this grand experiment in being church before, during, and long after the pandemic. And building relationships, well, I think that's also what will heal our nation when we've escaped the latest tyrant named Pharaoh.